my video. Okay. Do you want me to hit the go live then?
Yes. Okay, we'll just wait a few seconds for everybody to join. Okay, so hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar from the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So my name is Kate Lonsdale and I'm one of the two champions for the programme along with Suraj Desai, and we're based at the University of Leeds. This webinar series was set up to communicate both the findings of the research that were funded through the UK Climate Resilience Programme, but also to host webinars on issues of relevance to climate resilience in the UK and more widely. And if you'd like to find out more about the programme's aims or its funded projects or any latest news and links to previous webinars that are archived, I recommend that you go to our website, which is the ukclimateresilience.org website. So, this webinar today focuses on an area of great interest to the climate resilience community, which is about the economic case for climate change adaptation. And the timing for the event today is, so before we move on to the presentation, I'll briefly mention some items of news that are relevant to the programme. Then we'll move on to the focus of today's webinar, and our speaker, Paul Watkiss, will present on the findings of the CCRA on the economic costs of climate change and the findings of a follow-up study for DEFRA on the economics of adaptation. Then Nigel Miller will be joining us to give us a reflection on this work from his perspective in DEFRA. We should then have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions, and both speakers should be available to answer questions. So we very much encourage you to ask questions, and we'll use the Q&A function for questions rather than the chat. So please add questions as they occur to you throughout the presentations. You don't have to wait until the end. We encourage you to upvote other people's questions that you like the look of. As participants, you'll remain muted unless we unmute you. The webinar audio and slides will be shared with you after the event, and they'll also be available on the YouTube link on our website. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And just to remind you that the webinar is being recorded. So I've got 3 items of news. So firstly, some news from NERC, NERC. There's a funding opportunity. NERC have announced £5 million worth of funding on integrating finance and biodiversity for a nature positive future. And this is to be delivered in 2 phases, and the first phase is now open to applications and will close on the 20th of July. So this is funding to build community networks that embed biodiversity value into financial decision making, and the phase 1 projects are up to 1 year in duration. So if that sounds interesting, NERC are hosting a webinar in late June to provide more information, and they suggest contacting them on the email presented here. So you'll see that on the slides when they get shared with you after this event. The second piece of news also from NERC, the NERC Talent and Skills team at UKRI have an open call for evidence on training needs and skills gaps across the NERC area. So this evidence that they gather will be used to inform future NERC strategies and funding partnerships, research calls, and sort of future training budgets. They're keen to get submissions from people at any level in academia or industry, business, policy, third sector organisations and networks. The original deadline has passed, but they've extended the deadline to Friday, so that's the 10th of June. And if you're interested, there's an online form which they ask you to use, and that's available through this link. And finally, just to sort of point out this, the special issue of climate risk management on UK climate risk management, risk assessment and management. And this is now available, and it's got 7 papers that draw on research that's been funded through the Climate Resilience Programme. So we recommend taking a look at that. So now moving on to the focus of today's webinar, I'm shortly going to hand over to Paul Watkiss and then Nigel Miller. But first, I'd like to introduce our presenters. So Paul Watkiss is the director of Paul Watkiss Associates, which is a research consultancy that specialises in adaptation policy, planning, finance and economics. And Paul's got over 20 years of experience on applied adaptation and has been involved in all of the UK climate change risk assessments, and he led the economic assessment for CCRA 3. And he's also led the DEFRA-funded economic case for climate change adaptation project, and he's got a wealth of other experience of leading projects on the economics of adaptation in European and international projects. Dr. Nigel Miller is the senior economist and evidence lead in the climate division at DEFRA, and he leads a team of economists and scientists that support evidence-based policy development in achieving DEFRA's climate goals. And Nigel is himself a professional economist and has worked also in academia and consultancy and in government in other sectors, including crime and criminal justice, health and macroeconomics, and sort of works to sort of help his colleagues make the case for change by sort of clearly establishing the value of what they propose. So Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you now, and I'll stop sharing slides.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to UKCR for the opportunity to present this. I'm going to try and share my screen and just to check you can see that and see that it's all coming across okay.
That's
wonderful.
Fine.
So yes, good morning. It's very nice to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to talk about the economics around climate change and adaptation. And this is really, I suppose, a sort of summary of some initiatives and work that myself and also Alistair Hunt from University of Bath, who's very much a co-author on this, have done. I was going to say over the last 2 to 3 years, but arguably it's the last 15 years, to be honest. What we wanted to do was just go through, I suppose, a little bit of a sort of stock take on where we are and what we did in UK CCRA 3 on the economics of climate change and adaptation. And then some subsequent work that DEFRA have funded that Nigel was the sort of lead in DEFRA 4 on sort of mainstreaming adaptation economics, which I think is sort of moving in a different direction and to highlight some of the sort of issues there. And finally, just to highlight a number of research gaps that I think are there that, it would be wonderful, although we haven't got much time left in the programme, but the sorts of things that we really do need to start looking at. So I'm going to go through this first bit on CCRA 3 relatively quickly. What we do in the CCRA 3, and I'm sure many of you know this, is we have a 3-step method. We look at how big the risks are. We then look at how and if government is managing those. And if it isn't, then we look to see if there are benefits to further action in the next 5 years. So that's the 3-step method. This time in CCRA 3, as part of step 1, the CCC commissioned a little bit of work on the economic costs to help in assessing the magnitude. And that's what I'll talk about first of all. Just to highlight, when I talk about economic costs, I'm talking about economic costs as measured by government. So that's the full societal impact. So we value both market and non-market sectors. We'll put a value on health and environment just as much as on assets. And what's interesting is we did do this 10 to 12 years ago for CCRA 1. So that allows us to have a little bit of an insight on what's changing. And we did something new in step 3 of CCRA 3 this time, where we actually tried to look at the economic case for assessing the future benefits in the next 5 years. So starting with the risks and the economic costs, what we have in CCRA 3 is this enormously long list of risks and opportunities. Even the sort of priority risks are about 60 to 61 risks and opportunities. That gives us a challenge. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, when we've done sort of economic cost studies in the past, we normally pick 5 or 6 key sectors or impacts. When you start moving to 61, it becomes really challenging. I mean, you need to spend a couple of days on each and you've lost a year of your life. So what we do is a sort of high level valuation, and we rank the 61 risks and opportunities in terms of their magnitude, in terms of whether they're tens, hundreds or billions of pounds a year, both today and in future time periods. How do we do that? Sometimes we have some numbers that we can use directly. CCC, for example, commissions some work on flooding nearly every time, and we can take those directly. Sometimes we have, and we look at the literature and the sort of evidence on impacts and then put monetary values on those. And sometimes we have to work a little bit harder and sort of try and derive some numbers based on a little bit of sort of what if analysis and some scoping assessment to try and get a scale of what's there. And it's also worth highlighting that sometimes we just can't do anything. We just can't value them because we just don't have enough information. So the first thing to communicate, I suppose, is the sort of this dashboard about the 61 risks and opportunities and their sort of red, amber, green level in terms of the level of importance and the size of the economic costs. I'm going to start at the bottom because there are quite a lot of greens there, which are opportunities which we assess as being positive economic benefits for the UK. And that's maybe not a great surprise. The UK is a fairly temperate climate. I don't think anyone would describe the UK's climate as optimal. So there's going to be some upsides from climate change, and we do try and put some numbers on those, and those are potentially very big in some areas, particularly on things like winter heating demand. What we have then in the middle is a large group, probably still around 15 or so risks that we just really are struggling to value, mostly because we don't have enough impact on the physical impacts of those risks. So it might be cultural heritage, it might be some of the elements in the natural environment. We have some gaps. And then what we see going up is, an increasing number of sort of reds and very reds, which is sort of high and very high numbers, which kind of indicate that we have quite a large number, and certainly dominating overall, quite large economic costs from climate change in the UK. Now, the first thing I want to do is just give you a message in terms of how the numbers have changed from when we did this 10 years ago. So on the left, you have our sort of dashboard from CISA A1. On the right, our sort of dashboard for CISA A3. We use the same sort of method. The risks change slightly different. So it's a little bit of a sort of, an indicative order of change. But one of the things that we pick up very, very clearly is that when we did this 10 years ago, we maybe identified 2 or 3 risks which fell into the very high category of billions a year. When we look in CISA A3, we're picking up 10 to 15 risks that have that order of magnitude. So we've seen this really dramatic increase in the economic costs from a growing number of risks. And an interesting question is why that is. It's partly because of, I suppose, more negative climate science, higher sea level rise. It's partly because of a more negative impacts literature, more consideration of extreme events. But it's also generally just about better evidence from programs such as UKCR and others, and I suppose some economic valuations there coming through as well. So first key message is, compared to when we used to do this, we now think the economic costs of climate change in the UK are going to be much bigger than we did before. We tend not to put specific numbers on, and I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but we did sort of as an illustration say, look, here's a selection of 7 or 8 risks. Even if we add these up, then we're starting to think about something that's very significant. So what I put on the right is a snapshot of 7 or 8 risks. This is actually taken from a newspaper because it was a much better graphic than we were able to produce. But what it does, it just shows that if you go from the current level, these 6 or 7 risks have economic costs of several billion a year. That sort of potentially doubles or trebles by the 2050s and goes up by sort of, maybe an order of a factor of 5 by the 2080s. Now, one of the interesting things here is that when we talk about this is to communicate the size of impacts and say, look, this could be tens of billions of pounds a year easily. I suppose one of the interesting things that happened was we had COVID, and people's risks and sort of perceptions of what £1 billion is has changed. And we found this after the financial crash as well in 2008 and 2009. People sort of understood what £1 billion was then after the financial crash. And people, I think, now are a little bit more sensitized to, the sorts of money that government spends on COVID recovery packages, for example, or on cost of living packages. And so I suppose one of the challenges we're having is trying to communicate the scale of risk when people are sort of more sensitized to big numbers. We have a running joke now, certainly in European studies, that if we want to get the attention of policymakers, we need to talk about trillions of euros or pounds. But certainly that's an issue. And there's something that I want to highlight. Of course, all these numbers have huge uncertainty ranges. I'm only presenting central values as an illustration. One of the things that we are mystified, but we highlight that there is an inconsistency in what we expect between the 2 and the 4 degree world in 2080. In the 2050s, there's not that much difference between the scenarios. Most of the uncertainty comes from climate model uncertainty. but later in the century, of course, you get a big difference depending on your emission profile. The numbers aren't as big as we would expect in the 4 degrees world because the physical impact literature isn't showing that. And so one of the questions that we have from the economic perspective is, why is that? And I suppose in some ways we sort of almost want to challenge the physical impact community and say, there's obviously some non-linearities here that aren't being taken account of, because we would expect a much greater jump in the 4 degree world. And so, people would look at this and blame the economists, which is absolutely fair. But I think a lot of the reason why we're not seeing this is the underlying impact literature. Okay, adaptation. This is something that we didn't do before, and we have done in step 3 of CCRA 3. So we've started to say, if the CCC in its advice report is making a recommendation to government to do more in the next 5 years, can we make a case for that? And can we make a case for that based on the economics, because the UK does like economics? That's difficult, and it's difficult because it's difficult persuading government or indeed people to spend money today for benefits that they get in the future, the issue of time preference, and that's compounded by uncertainty, and there's other reasons as well there around why this is difficult. So what we're trying to do, and this is something that's gone through, that was in CCRA 2 as well, but we try to identify these building blocks for adaptation where we say, look, if you do this, there is a strong economic case. And the 3 building blocks are in green on the right-hand side of your screens. One is just around no and low regret adaptation, things that we probably should be doing anyway that give us immediate economic benefits. One is about where we have particularly a lock-in risk, and we can do things such as climate smart design and what we might call climate proofing, I suppose, to try and make sure that where there's an opportunity at low cost, we can do something today to prevent future impacts. And the third one is really thinking about the adaptive management framework and saying we need to spend money early on to start that adaptive management process, even if it informs future decisions. And that gives us the sort of option value that we might want. And those are all different. They have a different sort of perspective in terms of the timing of the cost and the timing of the benefit. And we need a portfolio of those. But what we're trying to do is to look at the economic case around those for each of the 60 risks and opportunities in CCRA 3. Again, that's very difficult. You only need to do a literature review in 60 areas before you burn through a lot of time. But we did find some things, and the way that we sort of communicated this in the final report was some a sort of graphic that went into the CCC advice report. This is the graphic. What does it show? Well, it just shows the benefit to cost ratios of a selection of adaptation interventions where we were able to find some numbers. So where we were able to find either a single point estimate or a sort of range of studies that generally make the economic case. So what we've got here is the economic benefit divided by the cost, the benefit to cost ratio. If it's bigger than 1, then that shows that benefits outweigh costs, which is a good thing. And this is something that UK government quite often uses in terms of trying to justify action and generally showing good value for money. So, as we go from left to right, we get adaptation options that have higher benefit to cost ratios, which are, the ones that we really should be encouraging government to do. And I think, this is useful, and it's been used by CCC in trying to make the case for why we can do and why we need to do more on adaptation today. But also, I think I would highlight that some of these are actions that we would expect, no regret adaptation actions such as water efficiency at the top. But also it's trying to recognize that some are things that we perhaps wouldn't have traditionally sort of picked out as an urgent thing, but are important. And third from bottom there, you've got an example of adaptive fisheries management, where starting to invest in that we think would be a really positive thing to do from an economic perspective, and it needs to happen now. So this is really about making that case. Now, one thing that I'll come back to later on, we didn't look at the costs of adaptation in aggregate, which is something that we sort of omitted. And I think that's one of the sort of gaps perhaps that we didn't do in CCRA. So moving on, subsequently after CCRA 3, DEFRA commissioned some work, and I would highlight this as sort of more in the sort of field of mainstreaming adaptation economics into standard UK government policy. Now, here's something I think is really interesting, and I want to just use it as a way and an entry point into kind of talking about this part of the work. Many of us have been doing adaptation for a long time. We have done adaptation economics, which is sort of focused on those sorts of costs and benefits numbers, but also we use adaptation economics as part of what's called the adaptation policy cycle. What is that cycle? That's something that sort of emerged, I'd say, sort of 12 or so years ago in things like Provia and mediation, which is this sort of 6-step method, which is now up there on the European Environment Agency Climate Adapt platform. There's a sort of 6 steps to adaptation nirvana. It's kind of how you go through and do adaptation. Now, those 6 steps, preparing the ground, assessing risks, identifying options, assessing and appraising options, implementing an M&E. And for those amongst us who are old enough, it was sort of largely stolen from the UK Climate Impacts Programme way back, 20 years ago. What we do as part of that process is we do some economics quite often, but it's in step 4. So it's really far around the cycle when we're getting to looking at the nitty gritty of, here's some options that we could implement, which of those are the best, or either providing a little bit of economic analysis to support our preferred option. So it comes late, and also it applies a very science first and techno-economic perspective to doing this. So quite often what we're doing at this stage is we're looking at sort of technical options for adaptation and making the case for them. And I put this up because I want to now contrast that with the way that UK government adopts the perspective of policy. And what we do in the UK is we have what's called a mainstreaming approach, which means that we mainstream adaptation into policy rather than the mitigation domain, where we have more of a sort of standalone and a top-down driven target-based approach. So in general in the UK, as in most OECD countries, we try and mainstream adaptation to deliver. And that means that the responsibility is delegated to the relevant government departments, and it sort of integrates into the existing policy landscape and delivery. Now, of course, if we're going to integrate in terms of that, we have to look at the processes. And the standard public policy process and the cycle in the UK for policy, is dominated by economics. I think we could acknowledge that, and uses the Green Book, which is produced by HM Treasury. Green Book's sort of like the Economist's Bible in government. Now, what's really interesting is this frames the way that government recommends we do or should do public policy thinking, and the way that we should design policy and act on it in developing UK policy. And if you look at the Green Book and everything that's there, economics isn't like we had in the EEA policy cycle at step 4, it's step 1, it's front and center. Economics determines what we do. It does that in a number of ways. It does that firstly because it says, look, in order for us to justify government acting, we need to establish an economic rationale. And quite often that's framed in terms of a market failure or a policy or governance failure. So the starting point is to say, why does the government need to develop policy in this area? Why is the market or households not able to deliver on its own? And once we've identified that, it looks at a policy perspective on how to fix the problem. So it's not about a technical dike height. It's about, do you have to regulate the market? Can you encourage or use market-based instruments? Can you, whatever it might be, in terms of trying to develop a way forward that would then subsequently be put into government policy. Now, there is, of course, technical and science-based underpinning and evidence that informs that, but it's very much going along a different trajectory to perhaps what we would do if we followed the EEA policy cycle. So what we've been doing for DEFRA is a little bit of work that sort of explores that, and that sort of followed on from CCRA 3. Myself, Alistair, and Frontier Economics took that forward. And I suppose the way that I would frame this work is when we put together the methods for CCRA 3, we sort of ask an exam question. And that exam question is, what should be the priorities be for the next National Adaptation Programme and the programmes of the DAs? And we ask that question very specifically so that we focus on what we should be doing on adaptation in the next 5 years, rather than focusing on 2050s, for example. And so our exam question for this follow-on work is really in line with that. So it's, what's the economic case and the costs and benefits of early action in the next National Adaptation Programme and the programmes of the DA. So we're trying to highlight where we should be doing something and making the economic case for that for short-term action, even if that informs and improves both short, medium and long-term adaptation. And that's a very different way of thinking. Now, what's interesting is we've done this before. After the CCRA 1, the DEFRA commissioned a study called The Economics of Climate Resilience. That was published in 2013. And interestingly, that did use that Green Book thinking. But for those of you who've read NAP 1, I'm not sure I'd actually encourage you to do so, but it didn't really resonate in terms of increasing the ambition or delivering a very large uptake in NAP1 in terms of adaptation ambition and in recognizing the sort of economic case for adaptation. So there was a very good supplementary annex produced on economics, but really it didn't shape the thinking in the way that perhaps we had expected it to. So one of the things we did in this study was to just do an evaluation and find out why that was. So the question here is what prevented that move towards a greater integration into delivering ambitious adaptation policy in NAP1. And that was really interesting. I think to summarize in 4 bullet points, which probably doesn't do justice, this was the first time that probably any government had sort of properly commissioned a study to start thinking about that economic perspective in policy with a adaptation lens. And so it was just challenging and new. And so, there's always takes a bit of time to do things. Many of the people that we interviewed said actually one of the problems was the ECR didn't have enough numbers. So, it would have been more useful to have numbers rather than just the economic case. And I think there was also, we have to recognize, some governance issues at play. So, after CCRA1, I think the climate division in DEFRA was something like 30 or 40 people and very quickly reduced down to a sort of handful. And so there was a drop off in capacity and action. But perhaps the most important issue was the political economy. And what happened at the time, because CCRA1 sort of came out after the financial crisis, there was a pivot in government. There was a big focus on deregulation. There was a big move towards austerity. And I think, there's a very funny quote from one of the people that we interviewed that was one of Nigel's predecessors, who basically said, they went to the Treasury with the sort of economic case and said they were met with polite disinterest. So it just wasn't going to fly at the time because of the underlying environment. And also there were some political issues, not least the sort of skepticism of some of the people involved in the sort of scheme at the time, and particularly the Secretary of State, that just meant it was never going to be very ambitious. So there was lots we could learn from that. And what we did was, first of all, make a headline case to try and address some of that. So complementing CCRA3, which is very much bottom up, we had a little look at the top-down economic case on climate change. Now, this uses some macroeconomic models, so it takes a large number of sectoral studies and feeds them into a large macroeconomic model. This was done as part of some European research. The figure just shows the headline number for England, and it shows for economic costs of climate change as a percentage GDP impact over time for 3 RCP scenarios. The key messages really are that if you look at 2040, first of all, we've got relatively large numbers, getting close to a percentage point of GDP, which is much bigger than we've anticipated and found in previous studies. So that's a big number. And then secondly, also that actually you don't get much difference between the RCPs in the next 20 years. And that's partly because of the lags in the climate change system. What that means is that, of course, net zero is incredibly important, but will only deliver benefits after that time period. And it really means that in the next 20 years, you can only address impacts through adaptation. So we would encourage people to sort of, is a way of encouraging government to say, look, you really need to step up in the next 20 years, because if you don't, you're going to see some pretty big changes. And we also tried to pivot the information with some complementary work that we sort of asked the question from a different perspective, from the perspective of what we would call the public finances, starting to highlight that climate change will impact on things like tax revenues, it will impact on government expenditures. And those things are really important for what matters for government in terms of getting the books to balance. And so we shouldn't see this as a sort of external problem. It's something that's sort of very much important for going forward in terms of the public financial management of the UK. What we then did is we dropped down and started to provide some what we call real world adaptation economic support. We couldn't do that for 60 risks, but what we did do was we focused in on the sort of top 8 risks and opportunities that the CCC recommended in its advice report. So we tried to look at each of these top 8 risks and say, well, can we apply some economic thinking to each of those? And we did that using a relatively simple method. Again, lots of steps. We like our step methods. First of all, to ask the question about, is there a case for adaptation now? That's partly based on the size of the economic costs, but it's also on trying to identify those 3 building blocks and see where we might have an economic case for early action. It's then looking at that classic Green Book approach and saying, well, what are the market and policy failures here? Why should government intervene? it's also then looking at where there are opportunities to act. And this was very much a demand-led part of the study, where we just went around the government departments and said, are you doing some strategies or policies now that we could do some economic support work for? And I think that was really important in identifying sort of entry points and good opportunities to kind of do this. And then, you know, picking up that message from the evaluation, trying to get some numbers out. So that's what we did. I want to give you 3 quick snapshots just as an illustration. The first one is around wildfires, where we sort of had a sort of demand from DEFRA to say, look, we think wildfires is something we're probably not giving enough attention to on adaptation. It was in CSRA 3, can we make an economic case for it? So this is a slightly more traditional approach, but what we did was we looked at wildfires. We actually dropped down on peatland wildfires just because that was where there was a particular interest. I can't remember if it's 20,000 or 30,000 wildfires each year in the UK. There's quite a lot. Those wildfires are started by people, but climate change is a factor, both in the sort of severity and intensity of those, and will increase. And we focus in on peatland because even though peatland wildfires are a relatively low number in terms of the numbers of wildfires, in terms of the area burnt, they're enormous. They're about 1/3 of all wildfire burnt. And that's because these things are big, and once they get going, they're incredibly difficult to put out. So we've seen a lot of sort of big wildfires on peatlands over the last couple of years. And what we did was look at the economic case around why that's important. So we built up this sort of economic cost analysis to say, actually, there's these huge environmental costs from peatland wildfires, partly in terms of the carbon emissions. You release a big peatland wildfire, potentially gives out about as much carbon as a power station. And in addition, you have sort of air quality and ecosystem biodiversity loss. So we put some values on those. And then we also looked at the economic rationale why it was appropriate to government to act in this area because of those environmental costs, and sort of looked at sort of policy failures as well as the market failures that were involved there. And then following on, looking at that number, looked at some potential areas where DEFRA were already thinking about action, and sort of did some cost benefit analysis to sort of make the economic case for early adaptation. And I think that was very successful in terms of getting this onto the agenda. And I think it's a sort of example about how the economics can help get that government case to act, and to sort of also present it in a way which is familiar to government economists and government policymakers to try and help make the case. The second one is around integration in the existing policy process. And this is where I think we were quite lucky. We were talking to some teams in DEFRA, and after the 25-year environment plan, there are a set of actions that government is taking forward. One of those is around biodiversity ambitions and targets. And there was an existing policy process that was going through that target setting process that we were able to piggyback on. So what happens in the policy process is, a set of ambitions and targets is assessed, their sort of level of benefits and costs is assessed, and that gets formalized through what's called an impact assessment, to then sort of take that forward as a policy recommendation and then transcribe that into policy and regulation. So what we tried to do was we tried to fit climate change and adaptation as a sort of support mechanism into that existing policy process. So it's a real integration. And I think the key messages that came through, well, first of all, it was a sort of test of concept. But also what we found was, in doing that, we found that it did change the results. So if you, clearly it won't surprise anybody, if you try and hit a set of biodiversity targets and assume a stationary climate, and then repeat that exercise with climate change included, clearly it is a lot more difficult to hit biodiversity ambitions when you've got climate change impacting on the natural environment. So you have to kind of spend more, do different things. And this was a way of integrating that in that policy process, but also then helping to inform the impact assessment to say, this is something that needs to be included in the policy process and translating through into what's measured and what the targets are to make sure we have climate smart policy setting. So, it's partly a formalization of a process, but it's also providing results and evidence that then help shape the policy itself. I'll come back to this a little bit later on. I think it was really useful to do, but my goodness, it was challenging. We had to get lots of support from lots of people, both people such as Natural England, but also brought in some sort of CSRA 3 expertise from people like Pam Berry to actually even work through this. It's incredibly complicated to do, and it's particularly complicated to do in the environment of a formalized policy setting, partly because of the information that you need, but also because of the timescale. Normally we'd want to do this in about 2 or 3 years' time. We had to do it in sort of 4 to 5 months. And finally, I just want to highlight one where we're starting to move through to sort of looking at economics in terms of influencing adaptation in terms of market-based instruments and those types of things. So we've got a case study which aligned to a DEFRA request again on the environmental land management schemes, which is a new scheme that's been put in place to replace the CAP program. And what that tries to do, it's a new way of doing this, moving away from output or sort of productivity targets towards rewarding land managers on the basis of delivering public goods. Really, really interesting as well, because mitigation and adaptation are listed as 2 of the key public goods that ELMS is targeting. So what we're trying to do here is say, well, that's great. We have a high-level policy steer. How can we actually do that? And again, it's a sort of integration issue. But there's 2 very specific issues that I want to highlight where I think it sort of revealed some insights. The first thing is we want to do 2 things, and I suppose this is to highlight. We want to make sure that ELMS as a package of incentives for land managers is actually climate proof itself. So if you are going out and trying to incentivize land managers to create new forests or whatever it might be, manage habitats better, you really would like them to do that in a way which is making sure they take account of future climate change. We shouldn't be incentivizing people to create forests that haven't taken climate risks into account, or wildfires, that type of thing. But also there's an opportunity through a scheme that's targeting public goods to sort of encourage land managers to do adaptation. So it has both a point of action in terms of creating awareness, but also delivering adaptation projects. And so what we've been trying to do is also look at how you can take a suite of ELMS activities and try and either encourage or have a greater focus on measures that are either climate smart or positive for climate adaptation, as well as more directly targeted adaptation projects and incentives. And that has led to some very interesting discussion around building in adaptation objectives to ELMS, but also in terms of looking at, well, could you even incentivize land managers through payment to do adaptation? And that then looks at what's the economic benefit of delivering adaptation and how would you do that with response to a payment to a land manager. So, it's really going that full cycle through to start asking the question about how you can incentivize that. So just to finish, insights. Well, compared to a decade ago, we now believe the economic costs of climate change in the UK are going to be much bigger than we thought before, hugely bigger. And that's scary, but I think it's also a reality in terms of better evidence and the way that things are changing. At the same time, we also think that there's a role for economics in adaptation. I'd say that's important to make sure that it's upstream. It shouldn't be in step 4. And I think given that the way that government uses economics as a core part of public policy decision-making, there's a role for economics bigger and earlier in that process. I think the focus on an economic case and that sort of green book lens is really useful, but it's completely different to the way that we have quite often traditionally done impact assessment and adaptation costs and benefits. And of course, we're now trying to integrate in a policy process, which again is very different to how we might have traditionally done things. And that involves some new challenges, but also some new opportunities. I think it's also interesting to take stock and recognize that although we might say, well, maybe NAP 1 and NAP 2 didn't do as much ambition as maybe we hoped, this is because it's really challenging. I mean, there's so much going on and it's so difficult to do this. We need to think a little bit about how to better connect the research community and our outputs to actually help government do this. And I'm hoping Nigel will talk a little bit about that as well. So it's a way of providing support to try and help this happen, because it's just not feasible to ask people in government economists to do this as part of their day job. They need support and information from sort of this community to help them do that. And I think, I'd also, it's always good to throw in a curveball. It does make me wonder a little bit about adaptation and the way that we do this and whether that mainstreaming approach is correct. And, this might be some of the things that some people want to ask questions on. But has made us realize perhaps that, having some sort of high level adaptation vision, having maybe a very strong policy champion might be beneficial in pushing this forward. And finally, just to finish, research gaps. This is, UKCR should sort of, this core business. We found when we looked at the valuation that we have a problem, and the problem is that, you know, I think it's the example, it's the man or woman who loses her keys, but keeps on in the dark and keeps on looking under the lamppost because that's where they can see. You know, we keep on looking and getting better information on the same risks, flooding, for example, and then we still end up with having 20 or 30 risks that we have virtually no information on. So we'd really think we need to sort of broaden that CSRA landscape and get better information on many of the gaps. The second one is the costs of adaptation. I don't know why we didn't do this, but you know, my old joke is I can tell you what the costs of adaptation are in Tanzania, but I can't tell you what they are in England. It's kind of really strange to be, I mean, and I think that's a really good gap. That issue around vision, objectives and goals and trying to use that as a way of incentivizing NAP ambition, I think is really important. We know we're going to have a big adaptation finance gap. We suspect that there's not enough public finance. We need to use economic and financial research to try and bridge that gap. And we're going to hear lots more about blended and private sector finance, I'm absolutely sure. And we have very little information on that, you know, already. And finally, the big one for me, you know, we're in 2022 now. This is the point where we are going to have to start pivoting. And, you know, the EU adaptation mission is already doing that towards transformational adaptation. What the issue there is that the economic toolbox that we have used for incremental adaptation won't work for that. And we need to start thinking about what we do differently to try and think about the economics of transformational adaptation to try and help build that economic case and that policy case. And I think it would be really beneficial to start doing that now ahead of the game, so that when those policy questions start coming up in CSRA 4 and especially CSRA 5, we have a little bit better evidence base to take that forward. And on that, I'll say thank you very much and stop sharing. And I hope I haven't run over too much. If I have a little bit, apologies. And over to you, Kate and Nigel.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Paul. Lots of fantastic insights to dig into. Yeah, so now we're going to have a response from Nigel Miller on this work.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Just let me start my video. Fortunately, my video is not coming, so maybe I'll just be speaking to you without video. Okay, so I think it. So that was a fascinating kind of account of economics of adaptation and how it's evolved through, I guess, the last 15 years or so. And there's clearly a clear kind of evolution there, which I think is really interesting, and a much stronger focus on being pragmatic and useful, particularly to policy. And I think we could discuss that a bit more and why that's happened. I think it might be worth at the outset me providing a little bit of policy context, as that's kind of where I sit in UK government. So the adaptation process is kind of governed by the Climate Act, the Climate Change Act of 2008, and that sets out a clear 5-year process. So every 5 years, there must be a climate change risk assessment. As Paul said, we've now had the third one, which was published last year. And then it's a statutory requirement that risk assessment is then followed by what Paul referred to as the NAP, which is the National Adaptation Programme. So in short, the CCRA identifies the problem for us, and then it's over to government to present a response. And where we're at right now is that the NAP is being developed and will be over the next year and will be published. Our expectation is it will be published in the summer of next year. And our intention is so the structure of that, I think this is an important point, which I'll come back to. The structure of that NAP is driven by the structure of the CCRA. And one of the ways in which we manage the kind of scope of adaptation is to try and break that problem down into segments, right? And that's how we have the 61 risks and indeed opportunities. The NAP will follow that structure. So it identifies, there's an element of process, identifying a risk owner, somebody who takes responsibility for each risk and opportunity, and then provides a policy response. And our hope is to embed economics through this next year and through the development of the NAP. So much as Paul described, we will be asking of risk owners to go through that Green Book style, economics-driven style of thinking, beginning with identifying a rationale for intervention and then providing some sense of the costs and benefits. So that's kind of where we're at and puts this into context. Now, in terms of, I think my response, Kate, there are a few points I want to make, and maybe these are kind of speaking to the direction of travel. I think the primary role for economics, much as Paul has alluded to there, is to help us make the case for adaptation, right? And economics is a very powerful tool for doing just that. So in UK policy development, the aim of economics is to help the decision maker to make a choice, right? To take action. And economics helps him to understand the relative costs and benefits of that action and consider the value of doing so. And I think looking back and considering what we need looking forwards, the emphasis has been, relatively speaking, on identifying risk, the nature of the problems, and as Paul spoke to, trying to put some numbers on the scale of those problems and value those risks where we need, and that's the right starting point in any policy development process, but where we kind of need to progress through policy development and think much more about the response to those adaptation risks and the actions we must take and the relative value of taking those actions. And as Paul said, the work we've seen up to now has been useful, but is relatively stylized. And what we've been trying to do is kind of really embed economics into pragmatic policy making. I think, and perhaps this is a little bit of a caveat, maybe it speaks to, it's my final point, I think it speaks to Paul's concern about kind of mainstreaming. I think there is a real challenge around having 61 risks and opportunities. And even where we have data on adaptation action in the case, and we have interest, a sort of demand for that data and to take action, it's extremely difficult, it seems, to be persuasive. And I think it's something to do with the scale and scope of this issue of adaptation. And the approach, as I said, we've taken to try to manage that is to break it down into lots of little buckets of problems, and that has obvious attractions, right? It makes it more tangible. It lends itself to problem ownership. But I think there's an agenda here looking forwards to continue to do that, but to try to cohere a little bit the case. So Paul's referred to the work on the macro type work. He's referred to costs of adaptation work streams. There is various thinking about adaptation systems, for example. I think this is partly about economics, but this is partly about communicating. If we are able to build a case, a more coherent case. And there's talk about spatial work and doing risk assessment and indeed adaptation economics around a space is a way of cohering related problems, I suggest. So if we're able to cohere problems and cohere responses, we're going to be in a better place to communicate and be persuasive. So I think that's, I'll finish there, Kate. Other than I think economics, there's a huge need for it in this space, a huge deficit given the scale of this problem. And the direction we must take is to make it more and more useful to a decision maker. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Nigel. Can I just ask sort of clarifying question on that? You say that the sort of the NAP response is directly kind of structured and set by the CCRA, so the 61 risks. So what flexibility is there to sort of change how the NAP is structured? Is that sort of set somewhere, or can it be rethought?
This remains. It may not seem a long way away a year, but it is quite a long way away in policy development timescales. So there remains flexibility about how we go about this. But I think my strong expectation is that it will be structured around the 61. Perhaps cohered in the ways we can best do that. And obviously the risk assessment coheres around sectors and themes, and I'm sure the NAP will try to do something similar. But the focus, and this is the mainstream, the focus is on driving accountability down to the risk owner, locating the risk owner, and then developing a policy response to that defined risk. And I think NAP will make progress in doing that. I think where it might be more challenging is to kind of draw it all together, cohere it, communicate it. And in turn, if we're able to do all that, there might be questions about the relative importance of certain actions. If if we have funding needs and scarce budgets, as I'm sure we do, there'll be questions around which actions to invest and which not to. And that'll be the challenging thing, I think, to do over the next NAP.
And I think Paul's examples, those case examples that he came up with, really emphasised how it's not feasible as a day job. So I guess from a sort of our perspective as a sort of research programme, like how can the research programme work much better to support NAP 3, NAP 4? Does that have to be done quite differently? I mean, I think, Paul, you mentioned quite a lot of different ways in which this has to be rethought, from being kind of options analysis to really upfront. So how does research support that better?
Is that a question for me or Nigel?
Both of you.
Nigel, do you want me to go first, or will you?
You
first.
Do you want to go?
Oh, God.
So your question: how can research support? I think the starting point is, and maybe this is true. This is a general thing for research. Yeah, is to make it as focused on policy, adaptation policy and adaptation action as possible, a relative shift in that direction versus helping. I know there are lots of gaps in terms of understanding climate scenarios and the risks, notably around natural environment risk, which is so close to DEFRA's part, but we have, relatively speaking, enough of that information. Where we're more deficient is knowing what to do about it and being able to sell that. So I think that, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think, sort of that will be the most helpful thing, to connect the research to adaptation action.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always think we're always slightly pushed off track because we always look at the sort of UK CP18, and that sort of guides us towards a sort of timescale that has a longer trajectory. I think the most important thing is, to answer that exam question about what do we need to do in the next 5 years, for action to address climate risk in the current, medium and long term. So if you think about that, you come up with a different way of thinking and some different actions and activities than you would if you sort of went through the traditional impact assessment approach. And I think one of the dangers is we've tried to fix that a little bit by going down the decision-making under uncertainty rabbit hole. And that has gravitated and pushed us a little bit towards looking at project investment appraisal, which uses decision-making uncertainty. That's great, but it's a very small component of the policy landscape, and it doesn't quite often, decision-making uncertainty for projects is good for projects, but it doesn't necessarily still help sort of DEFRA case on building the case. And so we kind of need to focus on the timescale, but also focus on the policy need in terms of the questions that, the evidence that Nigel and his colleagues might like to receive to sort of help them make that case for the, that period. And it's just a reorientation of the way of thinking about the problem.
Okay, I'd add one thing. I don't think this is specific to adaptation either. It's a general theme, but what is particularly valuable to policymakers is synthetic products. Yeah, so it's syntheses of what we know. So obviously the researchers are motivated by pushing the frontier of knowledge, and that involves very careful focus on particular challenges, particular methodological developments and so on. But alongside that, it's really important that the knowledge is continuously synthesized and communicated and pulled together. And I suppose I mention that here because of the challenges we know we face in adaptation. It's not particularly well defined, and it has this scale and scope about it. I think it maybe needs even more in terms of knowledge management.
Thank you. Okay, so we're getting a few questions through the Q&A. So there's one here. So Paul, you mentioned polite disinterest that you were met with when you from the Treasury. So not least about the short-termism inherent in our political system. So how do you get around that? And she mentions the Ministry of the Future, that the Wales has a Future Generations Commissioner and a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to help ensure that climate risks and the cost of adaptation long-term are given sort of appropriate and dedicated focus. So what are your thoughts around that, about thinking about the future in that way?
This is really one for Nigel. I suppose it's just an observation that we make all around the world, and I've kind of mentioned this before in other presentations, that you get greater adaptation ambition where you have very strong ministries owning the process and leading it. And DEFRA is a big ministry because it has agriculture in it as well. But still, there's always a question whether a greater impetus might be had if there was some of the other ministries had a sort of stronger linkages with DEFRA in co-delivery at the very least. I'm not sure a ministry for the future, if it's more important to identify the strong ministries and get them to sort of co-own than to create new ministries perhaps. But yeah, I think as an example, a sort of cabinet office role with DEFRA would be perhaps very influential in trying to push this out. But this is really Nigel's area, not mine. Over to you, Nigel.
Yeah, I agree. There are questions about sort of governance questions and there's political factors. I would suggest the way I characterize the Treasury response now is slightly different. They would probably come to me and say, well, actually, what are the three things we should do in adaptation? It wouldn't be polite disinterested, but it would be really, really help us focus on a few tangible things. And we always struggle a little bit with that because we think actually, well, we don't quite have the data to answer that, but also we're not sure it's a good idea to go about it that way because of the importance of embedding across all these issues. But I think that's the question they would ask now. I think its numbers are very important to Treasury, as Paul said. So, and numbers that touch them. So more tangible economic consequences on GDP and public finances may resonate. You also have to understand your audience, so that may resonate better with them than, for example, mortality related issues to do with health, heat and health consequences. I think there is opportunity. I don't think we're in the space of, I think Paul's comment about its interest probably reflects where we were about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we're not in that space. I would say the sort of mood music around adaptation is moving in a positive direction from a fairly low base. And our job is to try and sort of capture that.
Great. Okay. Many thanks, Nigel. Unfortunately, we've already reached the end. So there's a couple of questions that we can't answer there, but sort of thank you very much for putting those questions into the Q&A. So I'm just going to firstly say many thanks to the speakers, to Paul and Nigel, and for the questions. Sorry we won't be able to get to all of them. It just reminds me to say I'd like to make a quick plug for the next 2 webinars in the series. So we have one on a Tuesday. They're normally on Wednesday, but this one's on a Tuesday. So we've got Paul O'Hare as one of our embedded researchers, and he's going to be talking about his work with the Manchester Climate Change Agency, who were originally focusing just on mitigation, but are now bringing in more of a resilience focus. And then on the 6th of July, Murray Dale is going to talk about a piece of UK climate resilience programme funded project looking at climate information to inform UK decision making and how you bring together providers and users to ensure that it's useful, usable, and understood. And you can sign up for these on our website. So the recording from today and the slides will be made available to everyone who's participated. And so I'm sorry these webinars get incredibly rushed at the end, but just say very warm thanks to Paul and Nigel for your input today, all your insights. A really interesting webinar, and thanks for everyone's questions.